We're here to talk about Narrator, the invisible character, and I will let the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves, starting at the far end.
Oh, okay. Hi. My name is Kelly Barnhill. Oh, somebody. Thank you. I now have a name tag. Thank you so much. I'm sure it'll stay. It's perfect. Hi, I'm Kelly Barnhill. I am the author of Random Things. I just published my first short story collection called Dreadful Young Ladies. It came out last February. And I'm also the author of 4 fantasy novels for children. The most recent is The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which won the Newbery Medal.
Kelly.
Oh, that wasn't even on.
Okay.
There you go.
Do you want to introduce yourself again? So that,
Oh.
could you hear
Could
her?
you guys hear it?
Okay, good. Great.
Awesome.
Kelly is also your author guest of honor.
Oh, yeah.
Small details. My name is Mary Robinette Kowal. I am a writer. I'm a podcaster for Writing Excuses, and also a professional puppeteer and an audiobook narrator. So I have a lot of thoughts about narrators.
I am Emma Hoggan. I am the managing editor with Future House Publishing, which if you haven't heard of us, it's because we're super local and we're here in Provo. I've been doing that for about 3 years, and I've been editing fantasy novels and science fiction novels for middle grade young adult and adult age fiction. My name is McKelle George. I was an editor with Flux, which is a YA imprint. I'm also a YA author. My book, Speak Easy, Speak Love, came out last year. And I'm also a graphic novelist. My first graphic novel comes out with Legendary Comics in a couple years, because they take a while to draw.
And I'm your humble...
Oh, sorry, I turned it off, sorry.
I'm your humble moderator, Scott Parkin. I'm here to be neither seen nor heard. So let's ask the panelists a question. So the narrator, the invisible character, I thought the narrator is supposed to be totally invisible. What do you mean character?
As an audiobook narrator, let me explain. This is one of the things we talk about all the time when you're developing a character voices. The narrator is the most important character in the book because they're the one that communicates directly to the reader. They tell the reader how to think about a story based on the language that they use, based on the way things are framed, the order of the information that they present to the reader. There are degrees of how present a narrator is, how pronounced their voice is, and that's going to vary depending on the type of story that you're telling. But even in third person, you have a narrator who is telling the story.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I can't start a piece until I have a sense of what the texture of the language is going to be. How I want the stories to feel in the mouth, how I want them to lay in the ear. And so much of that has to do with what kind of relationship I want my reader to have with the text, right? Because that's what narration does. It establishes a relationship. One of the best workshops I've ever been to was years ago at SCBWI, where Arthur Levine was doing this workshop on first chapters, which really was kind of a masterclass on developing how you introduce the narration to your reader. And he was talking about it in terms of first dates. Your first chapter is a first date, because there's a lot of stuff we do in a first date to communicate what kind of ride we're on right now, right? And I think that is really the purpose of narration. You're communicating to your reader what kind of experience you're intending for them to have, and what kind of relationship they're going to have with the characters, what kind of relationship they're going to have with the world, and what kind of relationship they're going to have with the ideas that you're wrestling with over the course of the story.
So I feel like all editors have like that thing that they care about most, and some of them it's kind of a grammar thing, and it's like their pet peeve, and every time they see it, it just like drives them nuts. For me, point of view is like the thing that I care about. So like whenever I'm editing a book, like plot and okay, cool, and like your point of view. So narrator is really a big part of point of view, because sometimes your narrator is literally a character, and so that makes it really easy to identify. But sometimes in like those third person kind of point of views or whatever, it's not quite the character, and it's kind of hovering in this like weird place. Or sometimes you're doing omniscient, and this narrator is like this like weird distant character, and you can't figure out how much they're a person and how much they're just the facts that exist in the world. So it's really complicated when you're starting a new story, figuring out like whether or not your narrator is an actual character or whether they're kind of more the way you're telling the story that ties together the events that are existing. And so I don't think your narrator always has to be like an actual like character in your head, because sometimes your point of view really should be focusing more on the other characters in the story, and your narrator should be mostly pushing towards those or diving into those sort of voices. But for some stories, there definitely is that big overarching point of view there, that character there, that voice there, that is separate from those characters, and you need to figure out which kind of story you're writing.
I don't really have anything to add. I agree with all of the things that were said.
So, from a technical standpoint, what types of narrative voice do we tend to see? It seems like the narrator as a separate voice from the POV character has gone out of fashion. Is it coming back in, or can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, so when we're talking about narrative voice, we're talking about three different things. And we use a single word, narrator or voice, to reference that. And I'm going to use a puppetry metaphor for this. When we talk about style of puppet, we mean the same three different things. We're talking about the aesthetic, we're talking about the mechanical, the aesthetic, and the personal. So the mechanical is literally what kind of puppet are you using? Is it a hand puppet? Is it a marionette? A shadow puppet? And with narrator, are you talking about omniscient narrator, third person narrator, first person narrator? That's a mechanical choice. Then we've got the aesthetic. What does the narrator sound like? Or with the puppet, what does it look like? Is it fuzzy like a Muppet? Does it look like something from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? What is the aesthetic of the puppet? So with the narrator, you're looking at, here's 4 examples of narrators from stories that are all written in omniscient. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, A Series of Unfortunate Events, Pride and Prejudice, Neuromancer. The aesthetic of those is very, very different. Then we have the personal, and that is what the author themselves brings to the story. So again, using puppetry as an example, when Jim Henson died and Steve Whitmire replaced him on Kermit the Frog, Steve Whitmire is a brilliant puppeteer. He used to double for Jim in scenes when he had 2 characters in the same scene. Jim handpicked him. He knew he was dying. He handpicked Steve to replace him. It's an obvious mechanical and aesthetic match because it's the same freaking puppet. But everyone kind of panicked when the first time Kermit spoke because he was just wrong. He was just wrong. And that's because Steve Whitmire has a different personal voice. And that is the thing that the writer brings to the page. So when we're talking about how present a narrator is, what kind of narration we're talking about, I think it's important to understand that we are talking about 3 different things. So the question that you're asking about, whether or not the narrator who is separate from the character, the omniscient narrator, whether or not that's going out of fashion, that comes and goes. That and it also depends on the genre that you're reading in. In romance, the omniscient narrator is still quite present, where the narrator will bounce back and forth between the female and male lead, often within the same scene. In other genres, a lot of times thrillers, you're much more likely to see an omniscient narrator than you are in science fiction and fantasy. This is a fashion thing.
I feel like that's what I answered. I know that was a really thorough answer. The only thing I was gonna add was that yes, things go in and out of fashion, but if you do it really well, you'll bring it back into fashion. Like you can use any level of narration if you do it really well. And I'm not gonna explain it. Yeah, I think that she explained the different kinds super well. Yeah, and I think that what comes to mind is Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief, and how he tried several different narration processes with that book. He even tried death at first and was like, this isn't working. He's taking too much pleasure in killing people, and it's really off-putting. And then he had this idea with the colors, and when he made Death a more sympathetic character, he's like, this is my narration frame. And I think that you can do that too. You can kind of, do you guys know who N.K. Jemisin is?
Yes.
So she's really, really awesome. And I was at a conference with her last year, and she said that what she does is when she knows she's going to tell a story, she'll do what she calls tryouts for the story. And she tries different narrators, and she tries different points of view, and she tries different tones, different atmospheres in writing, and tries to feel out what does this particular story need.
Interesting.
And her most well-known trilogy right now is the Broken Earth trilogy, which, if you don't know, is told in second person, which is like, you are doing this, you are doing that, which I think is a really interesting choice. Because to hear her tell it, she was like, they told me that a grumpy, middle-aged black woman would be so unlikable and so unrelatable that no one would root for her and no one would follow her on this journey. And so what she does is she uses second person, so she's directly addressing the narrator, like, you are doing this, you are this. And I think it was really brilliant for that particular story.
With her point about doing a narrator well, and what that has to do with a style of narration being currently in, I think one of the reasons that most people in the fantasy and sci-fi genre can't pull off omniscient narrators very well is because the last time omniscient narrators were cool, like, writing had completely different rules, and you were allowed to tell for forever, and you were allowed to do all this kind of stuff. And so they're like, oh, omniscient narrators, okay, like, let's go write like we're still in the 1940s. And that's, obviously not going to be sellable, and that's not going to work. But so you're going to have to work harder to find examples and figure out what is actually part of that, like, style narration and what was the author's voice. And so learning how to write that is going to be a lot harder, but you can still do it well, and it can still work in a book, but you're going to have to search for examples.
John Scalzi writes an omniscient narration all the time. So if you want a really good example of that, in his newest series, Collapsing Empire, is it's omniscient narration all the way down.
So are a lot of Neil Gaiman's
Yeah,
books.
Neil Gaiman's also
And he's a modern writer as well.
Yeah,
so.
Audrey Niffenegger. Technically, the in Kate Jemisin stuff is first-person direct address.
Oh.
But you don't realize that until deep in, when the narrator reveals themselves.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, but it opens. It feels like second person.
Yeah.
All the way. I spent a lot of time cursing her because it's so good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another thing too, just from the children's fiction perspective. I mean, we're in a totally different realm anyway. But one of the things that you see quite a lot in children's fiction and is this idea of the present narrator, right? The voice that is sitting there in the room telling you the story, the storyteller by the fire, right? This is a narration tool that I've used, where the narrator is both separate from the story and also part of the story, and is also not super reliable because of that, because maybe they're trying to soften some details and whatever. But another one that just came out, Anne Ursu, brilliant middle grade fantasy writer, has a book called The Lost Girl that just came out, and what she does with that narration, I can't even tell you because it's a massive spoiler. So I won't even tell you what exactly she's doing with that narrator. But again, it's a narrator that is both present and not, and it's really brilliant, the way that she pulls that off. So it's called The Lost Girl. Super read it, all of you. Actually, I'm a professor, so I get to give you assignments. There'll be a test on Tuesday.
Please do.
Yes,
So,
ma'am.
short housekeeping note. If people have questions, I love the enthusiasm. Let's try to hold off questions until the last 15 minutes, and I'll make a flag so that everyone knows it's time to ask, okay? So, following along with that idea then, what drives your choice of reliable narrator versus unreliable or partially unreliable? What drives of a deep penetration first person or a third person or a second person? Heaven knows, I've used that in short fiction. What drives that? Because you talk about textures and things like that. What drives the decision-making process?
Okay, so a lot of it is worked out before I even begin, and again, trying to get a sense of what I want this story to sound like before I even start writing. And part of that just has to do with the peculiarities of my own brain. I am not a visual thinker at all. I'm almost entirely an oral thinker. I remember being completely mystified when I learned that people could see pictures in their head. How do you even do that? And so how a story sounds is very important to me, and how we experience a story. I'm also an experiential thinker, so I think in sensory details as opposed to visual stimuli. And so that really does drive a lot of how I think of narration and how I think of how my book both sounds and also appears on the page. But another thing too, so with Girl Who Drank the Moon, it is very much a hybrid narration style, because I really did want to wrestle with this notion of false narratives, and so there's the style of the actual story, but then there are also it is interspersed with stories that are told by some adult to some child. And all of these stories have details that are verifiably true within the rest of the context of the story, but are rendered false. And so that gets really interesting, because then you get to play with voice, but you also get to play with how we cast a detail. What we reveal and what we conceal, and how that can make something that is true and verifiable into something that is wildly inaccurate. And that became really kind of a challenge throughout the entire book to be able to pull that off. So so I think that how we and again, that all comes back to relationship, right? What is the relationship between the person and the text?
What she said.
That seems awfully complete.
Yeah. No, that was really good. I just love The Girl Who Drank the Moon. So I just want to add that it's exactly, as a reader, having that kind of narrator is that it is that storyteller narration that you were saying, is that even though the storyteller doesn't appear in physical form anywhere in the book, you do feel like there is some kind of entity guiding you through the story. And even though you trust this narrator, you can also tell that they are picking and choosing what to divulge to you. And I just think that it's that can be a tool that you can use. And I know a lot of fantasy writers in particular, I don't think anybody is capable of completely erasing their narrator voice. But I know a lot of fantasy writers who they're trying to. Like, it's third person and they don't want you to notice the narration at all. They just want you to be immersed in the setting and the action and the story. And that's fine too, or you can do the storyteller vibe, or you can say this is a character story and I want to do it in first person and let the narration of the character be really strong.
May I talk about something that you just mentioned, which was the fantasy writers who are trying to go for the quote transparent prose, which is that this is again a fashion thing. When we say transparent prose in modern day America, what we mean is that we're talking about someone who sounds like a Midwestern white guy.
Yeah.
A middle-class white guy, actually, really specifically. And that changes, and it can lead to an erasure of other really valuable voices. But again, what we're talking about there is an aesthetic, and people, a place where people are trying to overwrite their personal voice with someone else's aesthetic. I think when we urge people to write, quote, transparent prose, an example of why this will fail, or an example of how fashion changes. When Jane Austen was writing, she was writing transparent prose, right? It was the prose that everybody was writing in her day. In my first series, which is The Glamorous Histories, it's like Jane Austen with magic. In every novel, I would put in a line of Jane Austen, verbatim, just for giggles. And without exception, through all 5 novels, each time those lines got flagged by my editor and my copy editor as awkward. Which, first of all, gave me great pleasure. And be like, stet Jane Austen. But the thing that this points out is the reason that even though I'm doing a really pretty decent pastiche of Jane Austen, it doesn't. They jump out because that subtle difference in our personal voice, even though we're trying to have the match of the aesthetic voice, and her voice is no longer transparent to us. So I do want to caution fantasy writers who are trying to make their voice disappear and just have the prose speak for itself, that you are saying things whether you want to or not, and make those choices on purpose.
Destruction wins.
That's a good point.
It's fine. Well done.
Someone over there has a magnetic personality, or all of you, I guess.
All of us.
So again, just kind of extending that same idea a little bit. You talk about I just forgot my own question. That's why you write these things down.
In theory.
So when we talk about narrative voice, and assuming, I think it seems like we're by and large suggesting that character voice and narrative voice to some degree right now stylistically tend to converge. Talk about narrative voice as a revealer of character. Especially alternative viewpoints, right? Because to your point, we have heard an awful lot of white Midwestern men. How do we unlock the power of alternative viewpoint through the narrative voice?
Okay, so here we're talking about the difference between, we're talking now about, I think, type third person, where the narrative voice is closely linked to the character. With those, what you are looking at is applying an aesthetic that is not necessarily an aesthetic you grew up with, and caution, dear writers, there lies danger. The thing that I find is that the closer the narrative voice is to the character's spoken voice, the more tightly linked and intimate the book can feel to the reader, because at that point everything that is narratively on the page is something that the character is experiencing, even in third person. Whereas if the narrative voice is somewhat separate from the character, spoken character voice, what you wind up happening is some things, there's a slight emotional distance between the two. So when you're trying to reveal character, what I find it works best with this is to use free indirect speech, popularized by Jane Austen. And this is where the character's thoughts go into the text as part of the narration. Direct, not in italics, not she thought about, but just directly in. And what you're doing there is you're taking their spoken language and weaving it into the flavor of the words, the flavor of the larger narration. If it is a narrative form, a narrative voice that you're comfortable with, a spoken voice, then that can be very, very effective. If it is something that you're not comfortable with, it can be affected. It can feel quite false. So it's something that I think requires nuance and some attention to detail and a lot of research. Like, I'm very comfortable writing characters who are Southern, because my people sound like this, so I can hit those rhythms. I know what those are. At this point, I am very comfortable writing Regency, upper class women, ladies of quality, but I spent a lot of time doing textual analysis in order to hit that. And I don't have anyone from the 19th century like later wander in and go, "Excuse me, but that's not the way I spoke."
So another thing too, I mean, everything that we do needs to reveal character, right? Because what are we doing if we're not, right? Stories are about characters. That's what stories are about. And so I think one of the things that that is useful, I really like writing in the tight third. And in my when I teach, I talk to my students about thinking about headspace. You know, even if we're writing in third person, whose headspace are we in? And that becomes important because then you're not only thinking about, you know, how this person is processing what's happening, and how they're making sense of the world around them, how they're making sense of the actions of the people around them, but you are also using everything that is happening as a way of revealing character, because what we notice reveals who we are. How we respond reveals who we are. What we decide to do and what we decide not to do, all of those reveal character. And so, so I do think that that's one of the questions that we need to be asking. How does my narrative choice, how does this narrative texture, how does it reveal character, and how does it allow my characters to speak for themselves?
So I think it's interesting that they asked how a narrator can reveal character, and you immediately jumped to like a close third person narrator, because I think any narration style is going to have to communicate the characters in the book to you. Otherwise, how are you supposed to find out about them? And so I think I love a close third person point of view, and I think you can do some really cool things with that narration style. But I think omniscient narrators can do a great job at revealing character too. And kind of the difference is where you're viewing the characters from. So in a close third person or in a first person point of view, you have to describe your character as kind of they would tell you about themselves. But those more distant narrators can definitely show characters too, because in first person, you have your main character, right? And you have to show them kind of as they would show themselves, but they probably are surrounded by people too, and you have to talk about those people too. And you're doing that more distantly, and you're showing those characters more distantly. So in a more distant point of view, you're doing the same thing with your narrative for all your characters, including your main character, where you're viewing them from the outside, and you have to show the details and show the moments where they react to stuff and where they do stuff that will explain to readers who these characters are and how they're feeling about stuff from outside of their head without going into their thoughts. But you can definitely show characters in all the different narration styles.
We can go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience if anyone has any. Yeah, starting right here.
Are there certain narrator styles that are better for certain genres? Like fantasy, yeah, that's third person.
So repeating the question, are there any narrative styles that are better for particular genres? For example, fantasy and first person.
I'm gonna say I think that you can do any narration style with any kind of story with enough skill and intent. So I don't think anything is off limit, but I'm gonna use Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo as an example because up until she wrote Six of Crows, all of her books had been in first person, and suddenly she was like, how do I write a heist book if I have to stay in one character's head the whole time? And so she's like, I need these reveals to happen gradually to the reader, so I'm gonna have to switch characters. So I'm gonna be in one character's head who knows this piece of information, and then I'll switch to another character who knows another character. So there are sometimes, I think particularly, when you just need more than one point of view to pull something off. And there's certain things that are definitely harder to do in first person than in third person, but not ever impossible, I don't think.
I think you can tell stories in different ways and with the different types of narration, and so there's going to be different focuses. If you are writing a story about like some sort of personal trauma, about going through something really difficult, an omniscient narrator is going to sit there and watch your character cry for a really long time, and it's going to be super boring. But a first person, you're inside their head and you can feel all of the stuff that's going through them. So if the focus is on what's going on inside a character's head, then you need a narrator that is inside your character's head. If you're telling kind of a more broad, like, politics and battles and stuff that's going on in the outside world, then maybe you need to have a narrator who's further away from your characters because all of your individual characters can't see close enough what's going on into your story. So the scope of your story has a huge effect on what narrator is going to best tell that story.
Get a question here?
Yeah. So with regard to free and direct speech, how do you do that effectively so people know that's what you're doing? I had feedback like, why isn't this she thought? It seemed confusing to them.
So the
question was, how do you do free and direct speech so that it isn't confusing to the reader? He had received feedback from a reader that shouldn't this be she thought? So my personal feeling is that anytime a reader is telling you, I am confused, they are correct. Anytime they're telling you how to fix it, they are wrong.
Yes.
So let's just get that out of the way right there. Free and direct speech is basically a matter of signposting. Where you are, honestly, that particular piece of feedback just sounds bogus, and I would just discard it. So I'm like, so how do you do it well?
Yeah.
Usually if someone is noticing all of a sudden that you're putting a thought into there, it's because you have not been putting thoughts everywhere else. So it's not that line is a problem, it's that you suddenly decided to do something new. So if you want to have free and direct speech in your story, that's great. Have free and direct speech in your whole story, and then it won't surprise anyone and it won't feel weird. That's probably why she felt like it needed some sort of an indicator, is it probably was something new that you were doing that was out of the blue. And so, free and direct speech kind of is part of the whole narrator, part of that whole narrative voice. So you can't just randomly decide to do it in this scene and then not do it in another one, because then you're changing narrative styles, which is, I guess you can do that, but that's a really complicated way to write a book.
Yeah, it's much a matter of narrative consistency. Get a question back over here?
Could you repeat the book that uses first person direct address? I want to read that.
The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, Jemisin.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Within one work, can you switch how close the third person narrator is back and forth as needed, or does that confuse me?
Within a single work, can you switch back and forth between how close the narrator is, or does that confuse readers? Yes, you can.
Elaborate, please.
A really good example of that, if you want to read a really good book, is by Karen Joy Fowler, Sarah Canary. The way that she moves from just a really broad, like almost global sort of storytelling voice to the being close within the scene, and then close within a character, and then back in the scene, and then back in a different character. It's really quite deft how she does that. So I'm a big fan of the close read for how we develop ourselves as writers. And I mean, I think that you could do a close read of really any paragraph in anything written by Karen Joy Fowler, and you will become 1,000,000% of a better writer. But anyway, that's just me.
Yeah, I would just say if you can absolutely do that. I would just study books that do it really well, because you will get a lot of. I think that can be a turnoff for agents and editors seeing it if it's not well executed. So that might become a stumbling block for you. So just make sure that at a craft level, you're studying how it's done well. I guess. Yeah.
Actually, can I just say something, because you both said a thing that I think I want to just draw a line under for writers, that you pick up stuff from the things you read. I would like to encourage you all to stop reading things that you don't enjoy, because you're internalizing that prose. And it's something that as readers, it took me a long time to start putting books down that I didn't enjoy. But it's okay, and it actually will make you a better writer.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
So about finding an authentic voice as opposed to letting yourself borrow other people's viewpoints or other people's techniques.
I think that it's totally fine to borrow other people's viewpoints and techniques. That's not the issue. The issue is that it's garbage in, garbage out. If you're reading a book that is badly written, you're going to internalize those styles.
Yeah, well, and also I would add too that even if it's, according to everyone else, a fantastic book and it sold millions of copies, but you don't personally like it, like you can set it down and be like, this just isn't for me, and I don't like it, and I don't want to write like that either. Even if it's really successful, you don't have to do that.
Agreed. There's somebody asking a question way in the back.
Question back here.
I just kind of want to follow up what you guys were just talking about. Sometimes you'll read advice that says, read a book if it's bad, because then you learn from that as far as how not to do certain techniques. So how do you balance that between, okay, I don't enjoy this book, I read that book.
Yeah. He just said life's too short, don't read bad books. And I agree. But I think you can learn. I would suggest that once you're like, I don't like this book, identify why you want to put it down, and then move on. Because then you can be like, okay, this is the thing that's turning me off from this book, without slogging all the way through it. So.
Agreed.
You're also very likely to enjoy books that do things badly. There are really great books that have really glaring mistakes in them, and you love them anyway. So you don't have to read books that are completely miserable to see examples of what not to do. Like, read books you like, and then be like, okay, this was great, but, and like, so enjoy it and learn from it at the same time. You can multitask.
And at the risk of inserting myself a little bit too much into this, one of the things that I think it's important to remember is that you can never eliminate enough mistakes from a book to make it good, unless it's good to begin with. So be as honest and authentic to your characters and to your voice as you can, and everything else will take care of itself. Because that power, that energy, that passion will come through, and the reader will respond to it if you let it go and do it thoughtfully. Any other questions?
I have beta read several stories where they try to do tight third person, but they just jump to so many heads that it's just jarring for me. Is that when you would suggest going more omniscient? Or what would you say?
They're hopping in deep third. We're doing it wrong.
Yeah, and I hate to say this because, again, I think that in the right hands, maybe you could like dip really close, even in the same scene. However, as an editor, that is one of the most common newbie writer mistakes that I see, is that there's constant head hopping within a scene. Not well done, and I'm trying to make this a more helpful answer by kind of trying to pinpoint what about that is wrong and where the other times go right. But it doesn't feel, I think the difference is that when people who do it well, it's a choice and they're doing it deliberately, whereas new writers are just like, and then this character thinks this, and they're just writing how they think everyone's feeling and how they're kind of seeing the head without a more deliberate form and intention, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So one of the things that we need to train ourselves to do is to write within limitations, right? A really great writing exercise you can do is teaching yourself how to write a sonnet. It's really hard. Oh, it's so hard. Freaking turn. I can never do the turn. But anytime we have to force ourselves to write within a construct, we become much more deliberate about our sentences. We become much more deliberate about what we notice and how we communicate that, right? And one of the problems with head hopping, this is not to say that you can't do it. There's all kinds of stuff that they say that you really can't ever do, but you can find a million examples of people who do exactly that. I have made an entire career of writing the kinds of books that you're not supposed to write, right? So we can do that. It isn't to say that there are rules. There really aren't. But there is a beauty in constraint, right? And so really the question becomes not can I do a thing, but what is this thing doing? Right? How does this sentence work in service to the story? How does this sentence work in service to my character development? How does this sentence move everything forward? And if it's not doing that, then it's got to go, right? And so I do think that learning how to write inside of a barrier and writing inward rather than outward, it trains us to be more conscientious and careful in how we build the language around what it is that we're trying to tell.
Our time is rapidly coming toward that inevitable end. I'd like to ask the panelists to just offer any final thoughts or recommendations or anything else that just comes to mind.
Somebody else go first. I'm trying to think of it.
That thing that I said about the difference between mechanical and aesthetic and personal voice, the personal voice is the reason that you individually should be writing, because each of you is capable of writing a story that no one else can write, even if you start from the same outline, the same source material. Your personal voice will assert itself. And I would like to encourage you to explore and support your personal voice and also your personal aesthetic. Don't feel like you have to overwrite it in order to sell things.
Yeah, for real. And in the end, the story that you're working on, it won't exist without you, right? It won't exist without you. And you're telling the story that you're the only person who it's even possible to tell that story, right? And so how that story lives in your ear and how that story lives in your body, right? I think about that a lot, actually, about the way in which words resonate, sort of in the chest and in the throat. I think about that a lot, how the sentence will lay in the ear, and how it lays on the page. And this is because I'm a sensory thinker, right? And so what my sentences feel like is integral to how I interact with stories. And so, but that's me, right? In the end, we all write the stories that we are called to write. And we all write the stories that that we are the only person on earth who is suited to tell that story in that way. And so that's my main thing, is that nobody wants, this is why I don't want anybody to be thinking about what's fashionable or what's selling or whatever, because then what we have is a bunch of stories that sounds the same, and I don't want that kind of library. Do you?
As managing editor, I get to oversee all of the people who read through our slush pile. And I have to train them on how to, figure out whether or not it's worth to keep reading in a book after, like the first 10 pages. And they're always like, okay, so like cool science fiction, cool fantasy, like I really like the main character. And I'm like, okay, but like, does the author have a good voice? And they kind of just stare at me blankly, and they're like, I thought I was supposed to figure out if this was a good story. I'm like, yeah. Is it gonna be a good story if the author doesn't have a good voice? And they're like, oh yeah, I guess not. And as an editor, I can, if you give me something that's completely plotless, I have fixed books that were completely plotless in about 2 weeks. But I cannot fix a story that doesn't have, your heart and soul in it. I cannot fix that ever. So what you bring to a story as an author is it's not technical, and it's not following rules, and it's not something that you can be taught, but you discover it through writing and through practicing and through reading and through loving the way that words work and the power that words have.
I think that's all super good advice. My last thing that I would suggest to you to do, which I do as a writer, and it helps me, so it might help you, and I thought of it when Kelly was talking about how words, you can feel words sometimes in your physical body, and also kind of what Mary mentioned at the very beginning about like audiobook narration. And I always say that a good narrator can't save bad narration. Like, it still will sound awkward and stiff, even if they're very good actors or whatever. Anyway, so
actually we can.
Yes, they can.
Sorry, but your point being,
okay.
It's really hard though.
Yeah. Okay. That's there are some audiobooks that I'm like, I don't think I would have enjoyed this as much reading it. So you're right. But sometimes, like, someone's voice is so melodic, but I'm like, these words are so awkward. Anyways, my advice is to read your stuff out loud. And pay attention to how you are physically reacting to your own words, if you can feel them in a resonating way, and also if they flow well, and if they sound stiff. And reading pages out loud is a good way to kind of hone that narrating skill.
This has been a delightful panel. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.